Hello, my fellow Narnians, and welcome back to Narnia Lore. So before we start today, there are two ways this story could go already. Good Edmund, like he was in Prince Caspian and beyond, or Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe Edmund, where he was a jerkface. But for this episode, we'll go with Lion the Witch and the Wardrobe Edmund. However, I'll probably do another version of this with the Prince Caspian Edmund at a later time. So anyway, on to the episode. So, aside from Edmund being captured by the White Witch, that storyline, the main story itself would probably have remained pretty much the same. The Pevensies go to Beaver's house, then they go to Aslan's camp, Susan gets chased by Morgrim, Aslan's sacrifice probably wouldn't have happened, then they have a battle, then the coronation. Now, Edmund most likely would have matured at least a little bit during that time. However, he was not happy that he was still under Peter's shadow. Many times during battles, Edmund would attempt over-the-top heroics to make himself stand out more, but more often than not, it ended up being Peter that saved his life. These heroics earned him the nickname of King Edmund the Foolish among the lords and generals, although they wisely never said that to his face. Edmund's anger brooded deep down inside for years, and many times he would lash out at Susan or Lucy if they asked him if he was doing okay. He was especially violent with Peter for obvious reasons, and often gave counter orders during battles simply to spite him, not knowing that his bitterness was causing heavy casualties on the battlefield. Unknown to Peter, Susan, and Lucy, Edmund would oftentimes confront and badly beat generals who obeyed Peter over him, and once, Edmund even killed one. Eventually, Edmund lost control of his anger and finally made the move he had been planning for years at this time. While Edmund was brooding on his throne one day, Susan came to talk with him, trying to figure out why he had been so angry lately. After a few attempts at talking with him, Susan finally asked if Peter was the problem. At hearing this, of course, Edmund quickly backhanded Susan, knocking her to the floor. Clamping his strong hand around her throat, he spat out that she should never mention Peter to him ever again. Edmund quickly picked her up by the throat and stabbed her in the stomach. Drawing his blade out, he threw his sister across the room and stormed out. Storming into the general's quarters, Edmund announced that it was time. The generals that were loyal to Edmund quickly gathered their equipment and followed him. Mounting his horse, Edmund led his generals to the Black Mountains on the western side of Narnia. There, Edmund had gathered the remnant of the White Witch's army, as well as soldiers from the Narnian army that were loyal to him. It was at this point that the Black Dwarves gave Edmund the reforged wand of the White Witch, and they titled him their emperor. Meanwhile, back at Cair Paravel, Peter found Susan on the floor of the throne room and quickly called in Lucy, but Lucy, however, was too late. But Susan was able to tell them everything before she passed. Peter, of course, began to blame himself for everything that had happened, but Lucy quickly said that they needed to find Edmund and stop whatever he was doing. Edmund, however, was already moving in on Cair Paravel the next day. He had become more powerful than ever now that he had the wand, and they were wiping out any villages and towns they came across. Finally, at the fords of Baruna, where they fought the White Witch so many years ago, Peter and his army came out to face Edmund. Edmund immediately ordered his army to kill the Narnians. The battle wore on for several days, but Edmund himself never engaged in combat. Instead, he stood up on a cliff overlooking the battle, using the power of the wand to empower his troops from his vantage point. Despite this, however, Edmund's army had been overrun. Finally, Peter was able to reach Edmund, and Edmund, being so enraged at seeing Peter, didn't even try to hear what Peter had to say. Edmund threw himself at Peter, and the two brothers engaged in a similar to Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars. Peter, however, was able to gain the upper hand and slew his brother there on the cliff. The remnant army that Edmund had gathered, upon realizing their emperor had been killed, either fled or surrendered. Peter, however, was never the same after this. Although his temper never rose and he never did anything rashly or violently, he always spoke very little and spent much of his time in the library at Cair Paravel. Both Susan and Edmund were buried with full honors in the Cair Paravel cemetery, and many years later, when Peter and Lucy had finally passed on, their graves were laid right beside them. No matter what Edmund had done, they all still loved their brother. Wow, this was probably the darkest fan fiction I have ever written at this point. So yeah, that's one way that the story could go. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and I will see you all on the next episode of Narnia Lore.